Second principle, track maternal lines obsessively. Heremans discovered early that the most reliable predictor of a bird's breeding value wasn't its own racing performance or its father's quality, but its mother's breeding record and its maternal grandmother's breeding record. He started tracking families through the female line, recording which hens produced multiple winners, which hens produced daughters that produced winners, which maternal families consistently contributed quality. Why focus on maternal lines? Several reasons. First, you can definitively verify maternal parentage. You know which hen laid which egg. Paternal parentage requires trust or DNA testing. Second, the maternal contribution includes not just genes but also egg quality, development environment, and mitochondrial inheritance. Third, and most importantly in Heremans' experience, the hens that consistently produced winners usually had daughters that consistently produced winners. The breeding ability ran in maternal families more reliably than in paternal lines. This isn't saying fathers don't matter. Heremans used excellent cocks, but he selected breeding hens primarily based on their maternal family's production record, not primarily on the hen's own racing record or her pedigree. A hen whose mother produced 5 winners was more valuable to him than a hen who won 5 races herself but came from a family with no production history. Third principle, breed from proven producers, not proven racers. This distinction is critical. A proven racer is a bird that won races. A proven producer is a bird whose offspring won races. These are not the same thing. Many outstanding racers produce mediocre offspring. Some mediocre racers produce outstanding offspring. What matters for building a bloodline is production ability, the genetic capacity to produce quality in the next generation. Heremans would race a bird, see that it performed well, then breed from it experimentally. If its first round of offspring raced well, multiple offspring showing quality, he kept breeding from that bird and intensified selection within its offspring. If its offspring raced poorly, he stopped breeding from it regardless of how well the parent raced. He was ruthlessly focused on production results, not racing results, for selecting breeding birds. This meant he sometimes culled birds from his breeding loft that were excellent racers, but poor producers, replacing them with less accomplished racers that proved to be superior producers. Most breeders can't do this emotionally. They become attached to their race winners and want to keep breeding from them. Heremans was clinical. Production data determined breeding loft composition, nothing else. Fourth principle, inbreed to test, outcross to strengthen, repeat. Heremans used a cyclical breeding strategy. When he identified a particularly good bird, he would inbreed it moderately, breeding it to relatives, to test whether its genetics bred true. Inbreeding concentrates genetics, making it clear whether desirable traits pass consistently to offspring. If the inbred offspring maintained quality, that bird's genetics were breeding true and worth building on. If the inbred offspring showed problems or inconsistency, that bird's genetics weren't breeding true and he abandoned that line. Once he identified birds whose genetics did breed consistently through inbreeding testing, he would outcross them to compatible but unrelated birds from other successful families in his loft or from outside sources. The outcross offspring would have hybrid vigor, performing well, and would introduce genetic diversity to prevent the problems of excessive inbreeding. He would then test these outcross offspring. The best ones would be kept and potentially inbred again to establish their genetics. Continuing the cycle, this systematic alternation between inbreeding to test genetic consistency and outcrossing to add vigor and diversity allowed him to gradually build families of birds that bred reliably while maintaining health and performance. It's more complex than straight inbreeding or straight outcrossing, but it's more effective for creating stable bloodlines. Fifth principle, cull aggressively based on data. Heremans kept detailed records on every bird. Racing performance, breeding production, health issues, temperament, physical characteristics. He reviewed this data constantly and culled any bird that didn't meet his standards, typically keeping only the top 10% of each generation for breeding. This extreme selection pressure meant that every generation the genetic quality of his loft increased because he was breeding only from the proven best birds. Most breeders don't cull nearly aggressively enough. They keep birds because they like them, because they're related to a champion, because they feel bad about culling. Heremans culled based on data. If a bird's numbers didn't justify its place in the breeding loft, it left regardless of any other factors. This ruthlessness is essential for creating elite bloodlines. You cannot improve genetics unless you prevent inferior genetics from breeding. Over 15 to 20 years of applying these principles consistently, Heremans developed families of birds that reliably produced winners. Not every bird was a champion. That's genetically impossible, but the percentage of birds that raced successfully was dramatically higher than random breeding would produce. He had created bloodlines, families with consistent genetic quality. The bird named Bliksem, one of his most famous, was not a random discovery. She was the product of this entire systematic process. Her genetics came from multiple generations of tested and selected ancestors. Her production ability, she produced numerous top racers, reflected the fact that she inherited and passed on the concentrated genetics that Heremans had spent years developing. She wasn't magic. She was the result of system and selection. When Heremans sold offspring from Bliksem and his other top birds, buyers were purchasing genetics that had been systematically developed and proven through extensive testing. They weren't buying hope or pedigree mythology. They were buying documented production genetics. And those genetics continued to produce in other lofts because the selection and testing had made them genuinely consistent, genuinely superior. Now let's examine the Jansen brothers' approach, because they created arguably the most influential bloodline in pigeon racing history, and their methods show another path to the same destination. The Jansen brothers started in the 1950s with birds acquired from various sources, focusing particularly on birds with some Weggy and Steckelbot bloodlines. Unlike Heremans, who tested everything through racing, the Jansens focused heavily on breeding selection. They inbred intensively from the beginning, brother to sister, father to daughter, building up genetic uniformity in their lines. This created many birds with problems, which they culled immediately and without sentiment. They also created some birds with exceptional concentration of positive traits. Those birds became their foundation breeders. The Jansens were famously ruthless about culling. Stories from people who visited their loft describe them disposing of dozens of birds at a time, keeping only the absolute best. Their selection criteria were primarily physical. Structural characteristics they believed indicated racing ability. Wing shape, muscle structure, eye characteristics, keel shape, handling feel. They developed enormous expertise at evaluating these physical traits and selected breeding birds primarily on that basis, though they did race birds for performance verification. Their approach was more intuitive and physical than Heremans' data-driven method, but it was equally systematic and equally ruthless about culling. Through decades of tight inbreeding and extreme selection, the Jansens created birds that were remarkably uniform in type and remarkably successful in racing. The Jansen bloodline became famous worldwide because it consistently produced winners, even in diverse conditions and in the hands of different breeders. This consistency across environments is the hallmark of genuinely superior genetics. The Jansen genetics weren't just adapted to one loft or one racecourse. They were fundamentally sound and performed broadly. The Jansen example shows that there are multiple paths to creating champion bloodlines. Heremans' data-driven approach and the Jansens' intuitive physical selection approach both worked because both shared essential elements: systematic breeding strategy, testing of birds through racing or evaluation, brutal culling of inferior birds, concentration of proven genetics through selective breeding, and decades of patient, consistent work. Let's talk about the time requirement, because this is where most breeders' expectations disconnect from reality. Creating a genuine champion bloodline takes minimum 15 years, more typically 20 to 30 years. This timescale shocks people. They want results in 2 or 3 years. That's not how genetics works. You need multiple generations to test which birds breed consistently, to accumulate production records, to concentrate desirable genetics through selection, to remove detrimental genetics through culling. These 10 steps, applied consistently over 10 to 20 years, will create a bloodline that performs consistently in your conditions with your management. It won't be famous yet. Fame takes longer and requires that your birds succeed in other breeders' hands at major races. But it will be genuine, proven genetics that you can breed from confidently, knowing the offspring have high probability of quality. Let's address common mistakes people make when trying to develop bloodlines. Mistake 1. Changing strategy constantly. They breed one direction for 2 years, don't see immediate dramatic improvement, so they switch to completely different genetics and start over. This produces no long-term progress because you never maintain selection pressure long enough for genetics to shift significantly. Commit to a strategy and stick with it for minimum 10 years. Mistake 2. Keeping too many birds. They breed 30 or 40 young birds and keep 25 for breeding because they're all pretty good or might be useful. This is inadequate selection pressure. You need to keep maybe the top 5 or 6 birds, culling the rest. Keeping marginal birds dilutes your genetic progress because you're breeding from genetics that aren't exceptional. Mistake 3. Breeding from race winners instead of proven producers. They have a bird win a big race and immediately make it a primary breeder without testing its production. The bird might not breed its racing ability consistently. Test production first. Breed experimentally, see what the offspring do, then decide breeding loft placement based on production results. Mistake 4. Ignoring maternal lines. They focus entirely on the father's pedigree and racing record while paying little attention to the hen's family background. Maternal family production record is usually more predictive of breeding success than paternal racing record. Track and prioritize maternal families. Mistake 5. Insufficient testing. They breed 15 young birds and race them in 3 races, then make breeding decisions based on that limited data. You need to race birds through an entire season, multiple distances, different conditions to get reliable performance data. 3 races isn't enough information to judge genetic quality. Mistake 6. Emotional attachment overriding data. They love a particular bird because it was their first winner, or because it's beautiful, or because they like its personality. When the data shows this bird doesn't produce quality offspring, they ignore the data and keep breeding from it. Emotional decisions produce emotional results. Data-driven decisions produce genetic progress. Mistake 7. Not culling aggressively enough. They keep birds that are mediocre just in case, or as backups, or to have more breeding options. Every mediocre bird you breed from is an opportunity cost. You could have bred from your best birds instead. Aggressive culling ensures every breeding slot is occupied by proven genetics. Mistake 8. Buying new foundation birds constantly. They bring in new genetics every year from different sources, never giving any particular genetic line enough time and breeding commitment to establish. Constant introduction of new unrelated genetics prevents you from concentrating and testing any genetic family. Settle on foundation genetics and work with them for years before bringing in outside genetics. Mistake 9. Not keeping adequate records. They remember generally which birds did well, but don't have detailed documented results. Memory is unreliable. You need written records showing exactly what every bird accomplished and produced, so you can make objective comparisons and decisions. Mistake 10. Expecting too much too fast. They want champions in year 3. Genetics doesn't work on that schedule. Lower your expectations for early years, focus on the process of selection and record keeping, and trust that long-term consistent application will produce results even if early results are modest. Avoiding these mistakes dramatically increases your probability of successfully developing a genuine bloodline. Now let's talk about what happens once you've developed a consistent bloodline. How do you maintain it, improve it further, and prevent it from degrading? Maintaining a bloodline requires continued selection pressure. You can't relax culling standards once you've achieved consistency. Genetic quality isn't permanent. Detrimental recessive alleles are always present in the population, and if you stop selecting against them, they'll accumulate and degrade performance. Every generation, you must continue testing birds and culling the ones that don't meet standards. The standards might even need to increase over time as your overall genetic quality improves. What was exceptional in year 5 might be just average by year 15. As your selection process raises the baseline, continued improvement requires occasionally introducing new genetics for specific purposes. Maybe you want to improve speed, so you bring in a bird from a speed-focused bloodline and cross it to your best birds. Test the crosses. Keep only crosses that improve speed without sacrificing your other qualities. Gradually incorporate that speed genetics into your line. This is how you add characteristics your foundation genetics didn't have. Preventing inbreeding depression requires monitoring your genetic diversity. If you've been selecting within a closed population for many years, you might accumulate excessive inbreeding. Signs include fertility problems, reduced hatching rates, increased health issues, smaller size behavioral problems. If you see these signs, you need to introduce outside genetics from compatible but unrelated sources to restore genetic diversity. Preventing drift from environmental changes requires reassessing your selection criteria. If racing conditions change, if races start being longer distance, you might need to shift selection pressure toward endurance. If weather patterns change, you might need to select more for navigation in difficult conditions. Your bloodline needs to adapt to remain competitive. Think about the mathematics. Pigeons can breed at 1 year old. First generation, you start with foundation birds and produce first offspring. Second generation, you test those offspring through racing. Takes another 2 years. Third generation, you breed from the best of the tested offspring and test their production. Another 2 to 3 years. You're now 6 to 7 years in, and you're just beginning to have data on which lines produce consistently. You continue selecting and breeding and testing. By year 15, you have maybe 3 to 5 generations of documented selection and proven production families. That's when you start to have a genuine bloodline that breeds relatively consistently. But you're not done. You continue refining, continue selecting, continue removing problems, and strengthening positive traits. By year 20 to 30, you have a genuinely established bloodline that consistently produces quality because you've had enough generations to thoroughly test genetics, accumulate breeding records, and concentrate the beneficial genes while eliminating the detrimental ones. The famous bloodlines people want to buy, they're all built on this timescale. Johnson developed over 40 years. Van Loon developed over 30 years. Koopman lines over 25 years. You cannot shortcut this. Genetics requires generations to establish consistency. Anyone promising you a champion bloodline in 5 years is either selling you genetics someone else spent decades developing, or they're selling you mythology, not actual consistent genetics. This doesn't mean you can't produce individual champions quickly. With good foundation birds and luck, you might produce an exceptional bird in your first breeding season. But that's not a bloodline, that's an individual. Building bloodline consistency requires the time to prove that excellence reproduces across multiple generations. So what's the practical approach for a breeder who wants to develop their own bloodline but hasn't spent 30 years yet? You start with the best foundation genetics you can access. You apply systematic selection principles, you keep meticulous records, and you commit to the long-term process. Let's break down the specific steps. Step 1. Acquire foundation birds from proven sources. Don't start with random or unknown genetics. Buy or acquire birds from lofts that have documented success over multiple years. You want genetics that already have some proven consistency. You're not starting from zero genetically. You're starting from a proven base and building your own selection on top of that foundation. Buy birds from multiple compatible but not identical sources so you have genetic diversity to work with. Step 2. Test every bird objectively. Race every young bird you breed. Record all results. Don't make emotional judgments. Let the race results tell you which birds have functional racing genetics. Birds that consistently finish in the top 20% of your races are candidates for breeding. Birds that consistently finish in the bottom half are culled. No exceptions based on pedigree or appearance. Step 3. Track families, especially maternal families. Keep records showing which hens produce winners, which hens produce daughters that produce winners. Start identifying which families in your loft consistently contribute quality. These are the genetic lines you'll build around. Families that produce inconsistently are genetic dead ends. Stop breeding from them. Step 4. Select breeding birds based on family production records. When deciding which birds to keep for breeding, prioritize birds from families that have proven production across at least 2 generations. A bird whose mother produced 3 winners and whose grandmother produced 4 winners is genetically much more valuable than a bird who won 5 races but whose family has no production history. You're selecting for breeding genetics, not just racing genetics. Step 5. Breed strategically to test genetic consistency. Take birds from your best families and breed them to related birds from the same family to test if the genetics breed true. If the offspring maintain quality, you have a family with consistent genetics worth building around. If the offspring are inconsistent or problematic, the genetics aren't stable enough. Don't invest further in that line. Step 6. Introduce outside genetics carefully. Every 3 to 5 years, bring in a bird from a proven outside source that complements your program. Breed it to your best birds. Test the crosses. Keep only crosses that perform equal to or better than your pure lines. You're testing if the outside genetics improves your program. If it does, gradually incorporate it. If it doesn't, discard it and try a different cross. Step 7. Cull ruthlessly based on testing results. Every bird that doesn't meet your performance or production standards leaves your breeding program. This is the hardest part emotionally, but the most important genetically. Your improvement rate is directly proportional to your culling rate. Keep 20%, improve moderately. Keep 10%, improve significantly. Keep 5%, improve dramatically. The math is simple, but the emotional execution is difficult. Step 8. Document everything. Keep detailed records on every bird. Band number, parents, race results, offspring produced, offspring performance, health issues, physical characteristics. Review these records regularly. They tell you which pairings work, which families produce consistently, which birds are genetically valuable. Without records, you're breeding blind. With records, you're breeding scientifically. Step 9. Be patient and consistent. Apply these principles every breeding season for 10 to 15 years minimum. Don't change your strategy every year chasing trends. Consistent selection pressure in the same direction for many years is what creates genetic change. Changing direction constantly produces no progress. Step 10. Share your genetics once established. Once you've developed families that consistently produce quality, make those genetics available to other breeders through sales or breeding cooperation. This does multiple things. It proves your genetics work in other hands, validating your selection. It creates a network of breeders working with related genetics, who can provide future outcross options, and it contributes to the sport by spreading proven genetics. You walk into Leo Heremans' loft in Belgium. On the wall there's a chart, not a pedigree, not photos of champions, a chart. It shows 30 years of breeding data. Every bird that won a race. Every bird that produced a winner. Lines connecting mothers to daughters to granddaughters. Arrows marking which pairings consistently produce quality. Numbers showing win rates, production success, genetic contribution. It looks more like a business performance report than anything you'd expect to see in a pigeon loft. And that chart, more than any individual champion bird, is the secret to how Heremans built one of the most successful bloodlines in modern pigeon racing. Most people think champion bloodlines are discovered. They think someone gets lucky, finds an exceptional bird, breeds from it, and suddenly has a champion line. That's not how it works. Champion bloodlines aren't found. They're systematically constructed over decades through planned breeding, rigorous testing, brutal selection, and meticulous record keeping. The famous names you hear, Bliksem, Lariat, Kittle, New Freddy, these aren't magic birds. They're the visible peaks of massive pyramids of breeding work, where hundreds of birds were tested and culled to produce the few exceptional ones that became famous. Understanding how champion bloodlines are actually created changes everything about how you approach breeding. Instead of trying to buy a piece of a famous line and hoping that genetics will automatically produce champions, you understand that you need to create your own selection pyramid, test systematically, record meticulously, and build quality over generations. You can do what Heremans did. You can do what the Jansen brothers did. You can do what every successful breeder in history did. But you need to understand the actual process, not the mythology. So let's start with what a bloodline actually is genetically and practically. A bloodline is a group of related birds that consistently produce certain characteristics because they share genetic ancestry and have been selected over generations to concentrate desirable traits. The key word is consistently. One champion bird isn't a bloodline. A bird that produces one champion offspring isn't a bloodline. A bloodline is a family of birds where multiple generations, multiple individuals, consistently perform at high level or consistently produce performers at high level. When someone says Jansen bloodline, they're referring to birds descended from the Jansen family's breeding program that consistently show Jansen characteristics in structure, performance, and breeding ability. When someone says Bliksem mine, they're referring to birds descended from Bliksem and her relatives that consistently produce quality racers. The consistency across generations and across multiple individuals is what makes it a bloodline rather than just a lucky individual bird. Here's what most people miss. You cannot create a bloodline from a single exceptional bird. You can breed from that bird, but whether its offspring become a consistent bloodline depends on whether that bird's genetics breed true, meaning whether the desirable characteristics appear reliably in offspring, and whether you can find other birds that combine well with it to reinforce those characteristics. Many champion birds produce mediocre offspring because they don't breed true. Their own excellence was a fortunate genetic combination that doesn't consistently pass to the next generation. Creating a bloodline requires finding or producing birds whose genetics do breed consistently, then selecting within that family to strengthen the traits you want, while occasionally introducing compatible outside genetics to maintain health and vigor. This process takes minimum 10 to 15 years, usually longer, and requires testing hundreds of birds to identify the small percentage that actually carry and transmit the genetics you're trying to establish. Let's examine how Leo Heremans actually built his bloodline because he's documented the process, and it illustrates the principles perfectly. Heremans didn't start with famous birds. He started in the early 1980s with decent but not exceptional stock purchased from several local Belgian breeders. His initial birds were capable of winning club races, but nothing spectacular. What Heremans did differently than most breeders was approach the entire process systematically with clear goals and rigorous documentation. First principle, test everything through racing. Heremans raced every young bird he bred, not just the ones that looked promising. Every single bird got tested in actual race conditions. This gave him real performance data on every individual, showing him which birds had the genetics to succeed and which didn't. Most breeders select birds for breeding based on how they look, their pedigree, their parents' reputation. Heremans selected based exclusively on race results. If a bird won or placed consistently, it was a candidate for breeding regardless of what it looked like or whose offspring it was. If a bird raced poorly, it was culled regardless of its pedigree. This absolute insistence on performance testing is the foundation of creating a real bloodline. You cannot establish consistent genetics unless you know which birds actually have those genetics functioning. Looks and pedigrees tell you potential. Racing tells you reality. Heremans built on reality.